Adrian Crook has recently come to be known as the Bus Dad. He is a single father of 5 kids living in Vancouver, Canada. For 2 years, he spent hours every weekday riding the public bus to and from school with his kids, teaching them how to do it safely and responsibly. He checked with the transit operator that managed the bus line to see if they had a minimum age requirement for kids riding alone. They told him no, it is up to the parent. So over time, Adrian removed himself more and more from their daily bus rides until his 4 oldest kids, ages 7, 8, 9, and 11, were able to ride to and from school completely on their own, as a group. The kids' bus stop is visible from Adrian's living room, and they're dropped off directly in front of their school. The daily commutes went on without incident. In fact, after stumbling across his blog on Instagram, one of their fellow bus riders sent Adrian an email praising his kids for their excellent behavior while on the bus, and complimented Adrian's skills as a father. Adrian was no doubt proud of himself and his kids. Then one day, he got a call from the Ministry of Children and Family Development, or the MCFD, which is the Canadian equivalent to Child Protective Services in the U.S. They said they had received an anonymous tip about his children riding the bus unsupervised. There was no complaint about anything the children had done, just that this anonymous citizen was concerned that the children were not accompanied by an adult. They told him they had opened an investigation into the matter. Adrian did whatever the MCFD asked of him, including allowing them into his home to interview himself and each of his kids separately. He even agreed to their safety plan that said he would not allow his children to ride unaccompanied until the investigation was over. Adrian, having already written on his blog about teaching his kids to ride the bus, provided detailed accounts of the care and effort that he put into this 2-year process. He showed them the email from the fellow bus rider that complimented his kids. He provided character references and even invited the MCFD to take a ride with his kids on the bus to see them in action. They declined his invitation, and after a several weeks-long investigation, they called him to their office and told him that even though it was clear he went above and beyond what a parent should have to do to teach their children how to responsibly ride the bus, and even though it was clear that he was in no way negligent, his kids were no longer allowed to ride the bus by themselves. Then the MCFD took it a step further and told him his kids aren't allowed to be anywhere by themselves, in-home or outside the home. Turns out, with the help of their lawyers, they had decided that kids under 10 could not be unsupervised anywhere for any amount of time. Additional basis cited for their decision was a case where an 8-year-old British Columbia child was regularly left home alone for 2 hours, from 3 p.m. to 5 p.m., after school before his mother returned home. But that case had nothing to do with public transit, and it was a case where one child was home alone, not 4 children together. The MCFD said that what Adrian's kids were doing was just unsafe, that riding the bus is more dangerous than staying home alone. Then one of the social workers there said, "The freedoms that we enjoyed in our childhood were, quote, before we knew better." But is that really true? Are parents of today overprotective because they are better attuned to potential risks? Or is it possible that we're a bit delusional? Do we actually live in a more dangerous time than our parents? Has our obsession with overprotecting our kids and succumbing to fear been effective? Are our kids better or worse off as a result? These are the questions we need to ask ourselves. Is helicopter parenting working? In 1978, a boy named Frank Nelson fell through the railings at the top of a slide at a Chicago playground. The boy suffered a skull fracture and brain damage. He was partially paralyzed and left with vision and speech problems. A year later, his parents sued. In 1981, the U.S. Consumer Product Safety Commission published the Handbook for Public Playground Safety. They released this set of guidelines after a government report showed tens of thousands of kids, just like Frank Nelson, taking trips to the emergency room after being injured at playgrounds. There were several lawsuits around the same time, the period leading up to and into the 80s. Two consumer advocates/safety consultants named Theodore Briggs Sweeney and Joe Frost began speaking out against the supposedly unsafe playground equipment. They began testifying in court anytime they found a case where a kid had gotten hurt on a playground. These cases included everything from a kid falling while playing football to an incident where a boy was killed by a motorcycle that crashed into an unfenced playground. Some of the cases were truly horrid. Several kids had their heads trapped or crushed by a merry-go-round. Yikes. Eventually, the pair wrote and published a paper calling for the immediate inspection of all playground equipment that was installed before 1981. In 1985, the parents of Frank Nelson, the boy who was paralyzed after he fell from the top of a slide, settled for $9.5 million with multiple parties, including the Chicago Park District and the manufacturer of the slide. When news of the settlement was made public, parks departments across the country began removing equipment from their playgrounds. Frank Nelson's case had set the precedent, and even though the Handbook for Public Playground Safety was a set of guidelines and not requirements, it was enough for future litigants to point to as proof that parks were not meeting a set of standards. The parks departments, who had small budgets to begin with, couldn't afford to take the risk of being sued. Visit a few of today's parks across the country and you'll probably find most of them look quite similar. The Playground Handbook has gone through several iterations and it provides much more detail and it's widely used. One example from the handbook is grass and dirt are considered unsafe playground beds since regular usage can cause them to lose their, quote, shock-absorbing effectiveness. With these new systems in place, you would probably expect that we have significantly fewer injuries on playgrounds, right? But, in fact, the difference is only marginally better, if that. In 1980, there were 156,000 emergency room visits due to injuries on playground equipment, or to put it another way, one visit per every 1,452 Americans. In 2012, after the U.S. population had grown by 88 million people, it was 271,475 emergency room visits, or one per 1,156 Americans. But also consider that these numbers, which come from the National Electronic Injury Surveillance System, also take into account injuries on home playground equipment, and I would guess that far more families had home playground equipment in 2012 than they did in 1980. Now don't get me wrong, if a bunch of kids' heads are getting crushed in merry-go-rounds, let's consider getting rid of the merry-go-rounds. But playgrounds are just one more example of fear of their kids getting injured for parents and of litigation for government, causing us to take things too far. Was it really necessary or even helpful to get rid of dirt and grass and replace it with rubber bedding? Studies show that this kind of overprotective behavior in parents is doing our children more harm than good, and, as we've seen in the injury statistics, maybe no good at all. What parents probably don't realize is that the minor risks that children face when they are given more freedom and exposed to seemingly dangerous things are helping them. They're helping them learn how to problem solve, socialize, understand their emotions, and achieve the goal that we as parents ultimately want for them: independence. Most of the information about playground safety that I just went over is from an article titled "The Overprotected Kid," written by Hannah Rosen, published in The Atlantic. In that article, Hannah talked to a researcher named Ellen Sansider. Sansider did a study on children engaged in risky play. The study suggests that if children are denied risk-filled play, such as climbing high things, exploring on their own, and even handling dangerous tools, such as scissors or knives, that they miss out on important learning opportunities that would teach them to deal with risky situations, and as a result, they may be more likely to develop anxiety issues or other neurotic tendencies. The study even warns of a possible increased prevalence of psychopaths in society as a result of denying children risky play. But aside from play, what about crimes against children, particularly child abductions? If we give our kids more freedom to explore or be independent, like Adrian Crook's 4 kids riding a public bus together, are we putting them at risk for being abducted? Statistics say no, probably not. But let's be honest, sure, there is some level of risk to everything. Even when walking down a suburban sidewalk holding your kid's hand, there is some risk. But statistics show that the risk of child abduction is so small that it would be ridiculous to worry about it at this level. A Newsweek article says it plainly. They say, quote, "Nationwide, stranger abductions are extremely rare. There's a 1 in a million chance a child will be taken by a stranger, and 90% of sexual abuse cases are committed by someone the child knows." They go on to talk about mortality rates. Mortality rates from all causes, including disease and accidents, for American children are lower now than they were 25 years ago. According to Child Trends, a nonprofit, nonpartisan research group, between 1980 and 2003, death rates dropped by 44% for children ages 5 to 14 and 32% for teens aged 15 to 19, end quote. So if child abductions and accidental deaths are at historic lows, or at least recent lows, then could one make the argument that all of this overprotective helicopter parenting is actually effective? Well, no, again. Brian Kaplan, an economist at George Mason University, who has studied and written about child safety statistics, said, quote, "It's hard to say that much of the decline in mortality and abduction rates comes from stricter parenting. When it comes to child mortality, crime and accidents were never that big of a deal to begin with." He goes on to say that there are a lot of factors driving the trends downward. Better safety standards for cars and better pedestrian infrastructure, for instance. Declining rates of violent crime overall also likely play a role. Furthermore, if we look at Scandinavian countries like Sweden, where parents have a much more relaxed style of parenting, especially in terms of parental supervision, we see that their rates of childhood injury and mortality are not only lower than the U.S., but they're the lowest of all high-income countries. A recent CNN article cites a study published just this month, which it is currently January 2018 if you are listening to this in the future. That study shows the U.S. has the worst rate of child mortality among 20 wealthy nations. A quick aside, those numbers in the study include infant mortality, deaths that occur to children under a year of age. Infant mortality rates are significantly higher in the U.S. compared to all other wealthy countries, actually 75% higher than the combined average. And while that rate is not relevant to the topic of helicopter parenting, I want to point it out because even after removing that huge difference in infant death rates, the rate of childhood mortality in the U.S. from the age of 1 to 19 is still still 50% higher than the combined average of all other 19 countries. Now, I'm not trying to say that our kids are dying because of overprotective parenting. In fact, car crashes make up a large portion of those mortality numbers I just mentioned. But it's clear that this manner of parenting is not producing the result that we think it is. So, what are Scandinavian parents doing that we aren't? For one, Scandinavian countries encourage kids to explore the outdoors on their own, rain or shine. They play in parks without parental supervision. At ages as young as 6, they learn responsibility through freedom. Most children don't start formal schooling until the age of 7, and if they start before that, because it is made available, the curriculum is mostly based on play and cooperation, not reading, writing, and learning the alphabet. Perhaps we should consider the possibility that our kids need more independence as a vital part of their development. The research consistently shows that it helps them become better functioning adults. It helps them develop physically, socially, emotionally, intellectually. Fear of terrible things happening to our kids is understandable, but we have to look at the facts to realize that what we fear is often something that has been either sensationalized by the news, or sometimes we've just been given bad information. It's important to find sources you can trust for good parenting information that are based on facts. And keep in mind the saying they have in newsrooms across the country: if it bleeds, it leads. They're looking for the stories and writing headlines that scare us. And then they exaggerate the issue to make it seem like more of a problem than it really is. Like with most things, the sweet spot is probably somewhere in the middle. We probably shouldn't let our toddlers babysit our infants, but on the other hand, we shouldn't implant tracking devices in our kids' heads and hijack their brains like the helicopter mom did on a recent episode of the Netflix series Black Mirror. I was not paid to say that, I just really like that show, but I digress. We should make sure our kids are getting enough independence to develop the skills they need to be adults, but we should also take reasonable steps to keep them safe. I am trying to find that balance with my kids, and while I find myself hovering a bit too closely at times, I think I can learn to step back and let them explore more on their own. I believe it is one of the best things I can do for them. Kids are made to figure things out on their own. We just have to let them. As for the rest of the parenting community and society, I think going forward, the hardest part is going to be exactly what Adrian Crook faced with his kids and the anonymous concerned citizen that reported them. We're going to have to try to agree on what is reasonable. Thank you for listening to today's show. If you enjoyed it, please leave a review on iTunes. Those reviews help ignorant parenting be found by more people. You can also support the show by sharing this episode with other parents or friends on social media, or by contributing monetarily at ignorantparenting.com. If you would like more information about the subject matter and articles we discussed today, you can find sources and links in the show notes. Those are also at ignorantparenting.com. Included there is more information about Adrian Crook and a link to his blog, 5kids1condo.com, and a link to his GoFundMe page where he is raising money to fight the MCFD's decision in court. Finally, please stay tuned after the theme music today for a trailer for another great podcast that you should check out. My name is Chris Egan. Thank you for listening. Have a great day. There may never be a better time to look into the future and just see you. Now the devilish misconception that I'm sure you know, not everybody gets a ticket to the show. But what I found is what I thought.
A higher power keeps the back door unlocked. You may not feel that it's justified, but I promise, little one, it's true. There may never be a better time to look into the future and just see you. Now when you get free and you find the sun, just realize you're not the only one. And you can tell your mama and tell her well. You can tell your mama to go to hell.
Hey there, looking for another great podcast? Then tune in to Best Friend Banter. What's it really like to get a boob job? Can moms and dads be friends without things getting weird? And what's the etiquette on bringing a slightly sick kid to a play date? I'm Sarah Davis.
And I'm Evie Granville. We're co-hosts of the Best Friend Banter podcast. In every episode, we take on a hot-button issue you'd only debate with your bestie. We're smart, sassy ladies who aren't afraid to get excited, go deep, and tell each other they're wrong. No small talk, no BS.
So if you're looking for your next favorite podcast, the one that'll make you feel like you want to join in on the chat, check out Best Friend Banter on Apple Podcasts, our website, evieandsarah.com, or wherever you get your podcasts.